You are all at the free webinar using storytelling and persona research to guide design. My name is Michelle Sherritt. I'm the co-founder and VP here at Situated Research. Today, during our webinar, we want you to think about your products and what you're selling. And we want you to think about these questions. Do you know who your actual users are? Do you really? What do your users think of your product? Do you know? Do you know how to find out? Why do they use your products or services? Through usability research, you can really learn to tell your user's story, and that helps you to better design a product that fits your user's specific needs. Today's agenda, you're going to learn who your users are and how to tell their story. You'll also learn how users work together and collaborate with one another. You'll learn the benefits of persona research. We will also talk about how you observe actual use to improve design. Next, we'll talk about identifying who the user is, what they need, and why they need it. We'll talk about how to write user scenarios to guide the design of features. And lastly, we'll talk about creating use cases and user flows. So through careful observation of users, you can construct stories and sample scenarios of use that can inform the design process. A lot of mistakes that companies make is they make up user stories. They don't know who their users are. So they just make up scenarios, stories, give it to their team, and they design the product based off of that. There's no research involved. There's no observation of users, and they really don't have a clear idea of who their user is. So you have to figure out what your user needs, what kind of experience your solution creates for the user, and determine whether the solution will actually work or not. So today's webinar is all about personas and storytelling. Storytelling is a great thing to do when coming up with personas because stories are just a part of every community out there. Stories communicate culture, organize, and transmit information from one person to another. But most importantly, stories spark the imagination as you explore new ideas. Most user profiles are made up of demographic data, and this makes it very hard to use this information to make good design decisions. When we get demographic data, what does it really tell us? What do we really learn from it? Normally, in order to get demographic data, we do surveys or we conduct interviews. We also can use online tools to gather information, or we join conversations. And the information that we get are the ages of our users, which can be important, their education level, marital status, and sometimes specific questions like, do they use the internet? How often do they use it? How often do they do searches for certain keywords? And that all gives us demographic information about our user, which can be helpful. But if that's all that we get, are we really getting a clear picture of who our typical user is? Most likely no. So there has to be a new way of thinking. What if we started to think of the user as an actual person with a story and not just demographic information? Someone whom we can design a product for. So if we're designing a product and we have a person in mind, we're more likely to make sure that the features are useful for the user and that we're satisfying the user's needs and goals. So what's important? Many companies think that in order to come up with personas, they have to have an actual photograph of a typical user. And that can be helpful, but it's not really needed. How many personal details do we really need? Do we need to know their education level? Probably not. Do we really need to know their marital status? In most cases, probably not. So what details do we really need and what details can we leave out? We have to get behind the idea that when we make users as real as possible, we are bringing them more into the design element of the product. So many times companies come to us here at Situated Research and they're designing a product and they don't keep the end user in mind because they don't know who their end user is. They may have an idea, oh, well, our end user, let's say, is a teenager. Okay, well, what about that teenager? What specifics do we need to know? Do we have a teenager in mind? What's the typical persona for your user? And so if we actually have a more detailed description and we know exactly who our user is, we can design the product much better for that user's needs. But personas need stories. So where do the stories come from? Typically from user research, so from surveys, interviews, conversations, using online tools to find out exactly what your users are thinking and wanting. Conducting usability testing, so actually bringing users in and trying to use the product and seeing what their wants and needs are, and then doing your own observations. So why do we need to storytell? Storytelling gives us a very concise way to communicate. This is an example of a persona. This is Elizabeth. She's an expert searcher on the internet. And you can see on the right, we have her photo, and then we have some questions that she's come up with. And we also have her persona, her needs and wants. And on the left, we have her goals, typical questions, top usability needs, information that she's seeking, and some risks. And so this is a typical persona and storytelling of a persona. So it's just a few paragraphs, maybe one or two, just giving the story of the user and what their wants and needs are. So there are many kinds of stories, and they're used throughout the design process. And we're going to go through each one and kind of describe each one, and you can kind of pick and choose what would be best for your company, for your user, and what would work for you. So we have storyboard stories, we have design maps, key scenarios, narrative scenarios, point of pain, use cases, and flow diagrams. So let's talk about stories. Our Springboard stories kind of list our needs and our goals. Points of pain kind of show us the barriers that the user will need to overcome. With key scenarios, we're looking at the context for actions. With narrative scenarios, we're looking at what happens and why does it happen. With design maps, we're looking at perceptions, actions, and barriers. Flow diagrams, we're looking at actions and then decisions. And use cases, we're looking at detailed sequences of actions. So let's talk about Springboard stories. Springboard stories are very short and very compelling. They illustrate a dilemma and hints of a way out. They spark a new innovation, sometimes based on an anecdote from user research. Points of pain again show those barriers. So we create a vivid view of the problem that occurs from the point of view of the persona. We point forward to possible solutions that could be part of the new design process. With key scenarios, we're looking at the layout of a more complex scenario. The design must include these features. This is why. We begin to move into concrete illustrations of how the persona will interact with the product. So it's more detailed. And most scenarios are in words, but they can be put into pictures as well. Stories are very easy to create. This is not a creative writing project, okay? You just want to have a clear form of communication for your team. It gets easier and easier the more times you write them up. So there are some simple steps to get started. The first thing is to establish a goal and context. So why is the persona using your product now? What will make this interaction successful? And even what will make it unsuccessful? 2, you need to describe the interaction. Stay at a high level and avoid detailed descriptions of the interface at this point. Next, you must look at the end result. What happens as a result of this interaction? What made it a success and what made it unsuccessful? Next, you need to focus. Focus on storytelling and don't try to represent complete task analysis just yet. As you continue to write, imagine the new design in your head, how it will solve specific problems, how it will remove barriers for users, and how will it minimize risk. You can also use quotes from user research. This is a good way to get started and to get the persona's personality into the scenario. So how do we implement personas into the design process? First, we have to understand the persona. We have to look at the specifics of the problems and needs, wants, and goals of the persona. Then we can design. Next, we can evaluate the design, and we can look and say, okay, was this successful at solving the persona's issue, goal, need, or want, or were we unsuccessful? Let's start over. So stories really add to the bigger picture. Showing activities in context, it really helps you to understand more clearly when, where, and how a product will be used. Stories are an efficient way to communicate non-functional requirements or user characteristics. And thinking in stories really connects similar activities, attitudes, and goals across functions. So when we look at personas, we want you to explore situations and ideas. The persona has to be a character that provides a specific perspective. The relationships create the context. The imagery suggests emotional connections, and the language can suggest the voice of the persona. So UX stories really do have a purpose. Meeting the users, illustrating the user's needs, showing those barriers that need to be overcome. Also helps with brainstorming. And then we can have successful stories. We can design exploration for future features and also evaluate tasks. The benefits of persona research and storytelling is we get to put a human face on data. Typically, companies just get that demographic information and they don't paint a clear picture of their user. So by doing persona research and storytelling, we can put a face to the story. We can think about that face as we go through the design process. We can also simplify complex ideas for our team and break them down. It's a more efficient way to collaborate with our team and to show purpose. It also gives us an insight into our key user base. And it lets us set a project direction faster. Had we not come up with personas and done storytelling and actually had that human face in our minds as we went through the design process, the direction of our project could have gone in a totally different direction, and maybe not in the direction that we would have wanted it to. And then we would have more issues and more problems with our users. Some other benefits are better communication within large agencies and organizations by doing this, because there's a clear understanding of who our end user is, what their experience is going to be. And experience delivers meaning and value to users. This is an image that we found on the internet that kind of shows you exactly what some companies come up with when they have an issue with their product. So the issue with this is that it's a cell phone and the user doesn't have reception. So we're not sure if it's a hardware issue, a software issue, or a network issue. So this persona, with a hardware issue, you could ask your friends. If it's a software issue or a network issue, you could call support or go to online support. So if it was a software issue and you called support, how do you explain the issue? Okay, what is going on? And if you don't know, that doesn't really help. If you have a network issue, most likely you would go to your online support. And with your online support, you would say, I don't have reception now. I do. Here are my search results. Did it help? If not, go back to support. So this just kind of shows you a flow of what the different steps would be for a user who has an issue. So this is a scenario. It's also a story. And so this specific scenario could help a design team design the interface for this phone a little bit better. Maybe if there's no reception, a message comes up and states why there's no reception, what the issue is, so that they can eliminate certain steps, and that will make their life easier. So just thinking about the end user, knowing who your end user is and typical scenarios that could occur, and compensating for those specific scenarios that could happen, and making sure that you have every possible way for those scenarios not to occur and those problems to not occur, really helps your user. So that brings us to use cases. Use cases are written descriptions of how users will perform tasks. So it's from the user's point of view. So how does the system behave and how will it respond to my request? Each different case shows the sequence of steps that's involved. And we begin with the user's goal. The benefits of use cases are they add value. They help us to explain how the system should behave. They also help us to brainstorm what could go wrong. That's also important. We provide a list of goals that the user has. So this list can be used to establish cost and complexity of the system as well. Design teams can then figure out what features are requirements and which are not. Which features of the product do we need to focus on? And which ones can we work on just a little bit and put our efforts towards the main requirements? So there are some steps in writing a use case. The first is to identify who is going to be using the product. So we have to know who our user is. So we pick one user. So we come up with personas, and then we pick one persona and we go with that persona. We start with it. We define what the user wants or needs, that specific persona. So we could have 6 personas, 6 different types of users that will use our product. So we start with the first one, and we define what that user wants or needs. Each thing the user wants becomes a use case. So this first user, there could be 10 use cases for the specific persona, the specific user. So then we take each case and we decide on the normal course of events. We describe the basic course and then we consider alternatives to this course that could happen. We then look for things that are in common among those 10 use cases. We extract those and we note them as common course use cases. The things that aren't so common, we eliminate. And we repeat all these steps for each user persona. So for each of those 6 personas that we came up with, we repeat these steps. So we go back. We take the second persona. We define what that user wants or needs. And then we look at each thing the user wants, and that becomes a use case. So persona number 1 could have 10 different wants or needs. So those are 10 different use cases. Your second persona could only have 2 wants or needs. And so that would be 2 use cases. So for each use case, we decide on the normal course of events, normal course of action. What course are they going to take to achieve their want or need? Then we look at the commonalities among the cases, so those 2 cases for persona 2, and we extract those and note them as common course use cases. Then we go to persona 3, and we just keep repeating. So I want to put into practice what we've just talked about. So this example is where we are designing the activity for a collaborative calendar. So here's the problem. We write out our problem first. So our problem is David wants to schedule an appointment on the following morning with his friend Mark. He calls Mark's office, but he's in a meeting at that time. David leaves a message on Mark's answering machine. After his meeting, Mark leaves in a hurry to go shopping and forgets to check his answering machine. The following day, Mark comes into the office mid-afternoon and checks his messages. He tries to call back David, but he is not home. He then sends him an email telling him that he was sorry to miss him earlier that morning and asks him to call back. David doesn't get the message until the weekend, and 3 days have passed since David had to urgently meet Mark. They continue to play phone and email tag in an attempt to set up a meeting. So this is our problem. Okay, David wants to set up a meeting with Mark. They're playing phone tag. They can't communicate with one another. They keep missing each other. And David needed him a few days ago. Now that need is gone. So our derived activity design scenario to solve this problem. David wants to schedule an appointment with Mark using Google Calendar, an online calendar for collaborative work. He is able to check Mark's schedule, which shows what time he is available. On his calendar, Mark has set aside time for all private appointments, which allows the calendar to show David to see when Mark is available. David then chooses tentatively 2 possible times to meet with Mark. An email to the involved parties is automatically generated by the calendar system, relaying the request for an appointment. Next time Mark checks his email, he sees the request by David and then can approve or reject one of the possible meeting times. This information is returned electronically to the calendar, which will reserve the time upon approval, or repeat the process above upon rejection of the possible meeting time. So our problem above was that David and Mark are playing phone tag. They weren't able to schedule an appointment when David needed it. Several days passed. David doesn't need the appointment anymore. So that was our original problem. So we're going to design a collaborative calendar, and that will allow David to go on, be able to view Mark's calendar, be able to request some times, and then David will see an email, or I'm sorry, Mark will see an email saying, hey, David wants these times, and Mark will pick one. So we do a claims analysis. We look at the proposed activity design feature, and we look at the hypothesized pros or cons of the feature. So the first thing is putting a calendar online. So let's say we designed Google Calendar. So that would be our feature. The pros are that the calendar would be available anywhere and any time where a computer or an internet connection existed. Another pro would be the calendar could be printed at any time. A con would be that we need a computer and internet access to access the calendar, otherwise we can't view it. Another con would be if the server went down, we wouldn't be able to view the calendar either. Another proposed activity design feature is the calendar email facilities. So the pros are it allows instant notification via a commonly available medium. And a con would be it's worthless if the user doesn't read email frequently. So if we go back to our scenario, our derived activity design scenario, David goes online, accesses Mark's online calendar, and can see all the dates and times that he's available. He then can propose 2 possible times to meet with Mark. An email is generated and it's sent to all parties that are involved, so to Mark and David. And the next time Mark checks his email, he sees the request. But a problem could be that maybe Mark only checks his email once a week. Or maybe Mark never checks his email. Then he's never going to get this request. So that's a problem. So we're going to go ahead and look at the task model and essential use cases. And let's just look at if you were going to request an appointment. So this is sort of a flow chart of events that would occur. So the user action is on the left and the system response is on the right. So what you want to look at is what will the user do? And then how will the system respond to that? And you can give this to a programmer. And then they can go ahead and design the product based off of this. So a user will access the Google Calendar. They log in. And then the system will display the Google Calendar. The user will then request their friend's schedule. The system will respond by displaying that schedule. Then the user will scan the friend's schedule for available time slots and decide on a possible time to meet. The system will respond by confirming the chosen time slot availability and notify all involved parties of appointment time through email. The user will then log out. So you see how that works. We go to the user action, and then what will the system do when the user does this? And then after the system responds, what will the user come back and do? So it kind of gives the design team an idea of an actual story of how the user will use this product, which gives them a better idea of how they're going to design the product. We also come up with navigation maps. So here we're looking at the user's calendar view. And if you're looking at the user's calendar view, you can make appointments. You can look at the other user's calendar. You can select meeting times, and then that meeting time confirmation view as well. You can also edit the calendar. So you can use the user's calendar edit mode view. You can create a new entry, and then you can look at that new entry view. So this kind of gives you a roadmap to the navigation of the system, which also helps with the design process. And it takes you through exactly different scenarios that a user would use when using your product. So that concludes today's webinar. I want to thank everyone for attending today. And remember that this was brought to you by Situated Research. And there's our contact information. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. This video will be made available on YouTube, and it'll be available later on today. And it'll also be available on our Facebook page and our website. So be sure to check that out. And if you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future webinars, we would be more than happy to hear from you, and we would love to answer any questions that you might have too. So email us at info@situatedresearch.com. I want to thank you all for attending today, and have a great afternoon.